All right. I thought I'd do a video this time of not guitar playing, but more or less some of the books that I use. In particular, this book. It's sure you guys know this. He played a telly a lot. Ted Greene, Jazz Guitar Single Note Soloing Volume One. I had this book a while back, and I couldn't find a copy of it, so I repurchased it. And usually when I buy a book, um, I don't like to read the introduction, believe it or not, or what the approach is. I like to usually just run to the music and try to figure out what they're trying to accomplish or what they're trying to teach. But I thought it'd be appropriate for the purpose of this video is to kind of read a couple of the little excerpt and see if this is applicable to you guys. I know a lot of the things that he talks about at the beginning of the introduction. I felt like, oh my God, this is my life. So he starts off in the introduction. He says, many years ago, there was a period when I was buying and listening to albums by many of the great jazz guitarists of the time, such as Tal Farlow, Johnny Smith, Howard Roberts, Wes Montgomery, and early Joe Pass, to name a few. Because I loved the sounds that they made, occasionally I would try to figure out what they were doing. At first, because I didn't have a really good ear, this was an almost total disaster. Like on a good day, if I was lucky, I might figure out one part of one song on one album. And even though these little successes would excite me, it would also leave me with an empty feeling. Like I might figure out one of Wes's really good licks, but I would usually end up with just that one good lick, but no understanding of why it worked or why Wes used it where he did or where he was fingering it or how I could make up similar runs or anything. That described my whole upbringing. I would listen to Mikosa. I would listen to a lot of Wes Montgomery stuff, Tal Farlow stuff, and I could usually figure out a couple of lines. I had a pretty decent ears, and I still do, but I could never figure out the whole solo. So these guys that have perfect pitch, that can figure out these kind of things, they always amaze me. And so part of my challenge growing up is that I had a good ear, but not a great ear. And some people have a bad ear and they can't figure things out by ear, or it's really, really frustrating, or you just figure out 10% of it and you can't figure out the rest of it. And so, yeah, you're happy, but you're also frustrated because you can't figure out the whole solo. So that was very, very common. And as I read this, I said, wow, this is me. So he writes on, and whenever I was fortunate enough to get together with a good jazz player or try to play a little or even take some lessons, as soon as they started playing, I would be so thrilled by what they were doing that one of two things would happen. Either A, I would barely be able to talk and I would just want to watch them play and listen to them for hours, or B, I would want to say so much, to ask so many questions that I might babble out a few things like, what was that? Wow, how'd you do that? Very, very, very common. As I was growing up, I was fortunate that I saw some really great jazz musicians and jazz guitarists. And every time I saw it, I didn't know how people played over chords. You'd have somebody playing runs, and I was like, oh my God. I remember being at the 55 Blues Bar and watching Mike Stern play and all these guys. I didn't know what to do. I was so amazed, and I would ask a lot of questions. I feel like, oh, this is so dumb. They just looked, everything seemed to flow naturally. It didn't seem like they ever worked out of a book or took lessons. It just seems like they were born, and they were born as, hey, I'm born as Mike Stern. I'm born as Joe Pass, things of that nature. So it was very, very frustrating, even from that perspective, whenever I would get together with a jazz player or I would see somebody play live. They were just so damn good. So that was, another thing. And he writes a little bit more about, but there was another mistake I was, but there was another mistake I was making at the time. When someone would teach me some new chord or song or run, I would be so excited that I would usually forget to ask why they did what they did. I was so overjoyed that as a result, the feeling part of me would kick in real strongly, but the thinking part would kind of temporarily take a vacation. On those few occasions when I did remember to ask why, I was usually greeted with answers that boiled down to, I found these sounds by ear, but I don't know why they work. Yeah, that's the hipster guitarist. Wow, man, that sounds really good. Can you tell me what you're doing? I don't know what I'm doing. It just sounds good. You know, I'm just using my ear and going with the flow. It's like all very organic. And, you know, whether or not people let you into their style of playing jazz is not a mystery. It's very mathematical in its own way. And there's a reason why certain things sounds good over some things. I don't care if you're listening to, um, Alan Holdsworth. I don't care if you're listening to, Wes Montgomery, Tal Farlow, Joe Pass, Grant Greene. There's a reason behind that. So I think that a lot of the sounds and a lot of styles can be played, or can be boiled down to some certain logic or reason. But at the same time, they have their own styles and their own inflections that they put into it and their own earthiness. But this whole hipster notion that I'm just playing what I want to play, that doesn't always fly. Okay. Very rarely. Even Wes Montgomery does this whole notion that he learned to play the guitar at 19 years old and, it's all by ear. That's not true. There's videos. I think there's a video online where Wes Montgomery's telling the guy that the chord is wrong and here's the construct of it. And his brother, what's his name? Buddy Montgomery played the bass. That's not true. It's not true. And if they didn't know anything by the time they got through all these sessions with people, they knew some theory and they had some fundamental constructs of that stuff. So, but this was an issue for me too, as far as like, this whole notion about it feels good, but they don't know what they're doing from that perspective. He writes on, and this is what the book is basically about. It's about single note soloing. He goes, but the single note area of jazz playing was another story. I bought quite a few books on this fine subject, each of which had something to offer, but I seem to keep running up against one of three problems. The first one, the books only went up to a certain level. The second one, if they included better sounds, the explanations were almost totally absent. I was looking for principles of why, so that for me, I wanted to be more consistent. So it's about consistency and the reason why. Now that second point, he was a little bit better than me as a kid, or as a growing up as a musician, or as a wannabe musician, because this is more or less a hobby. I didn't really care why sometimes. If it sounded good, I was just happy. I said, hey man, it sounds hip. It sounds like I know what I'm doing. So I like that. It was only later on I started wanting to say, like, okay, I want to replicate this. So I want to know why this thing sounds good over this chord or this jazz progression. And I really wanted to ask the question why. So that was important to me as I got older. And it's funny, the more you start asking the question why something is something, the more questions that you have. It's like the more you know that you don't know, put it that way. And then the third thing he writes that if a book included good sounds and some explanations or principle, it always seemed to be confusing and to propose some very cumbersome burdens on the brain. So let's go over those three things that he said that. So the first one that he said was books only went up to a certain level, but didn't really deal with the really hip sounds that many of his favorite players were using. That falls into the category of Mel Bay book one. And I love Mel Bay books, but bottom line is that, you buy Mel Bay book one, you're going to learn to read music, you're going to learn stuff, but it's going to be about the Buffalo Gals. It's not going to be, some hip sound that Wes Montgomery played or somebody else played. The second thing is that if they included better sounds, the explanation sucked. They didn't explain it fully why this was the case. There was always some kind of gap in the explanations. And the thing is, nobody can ever account for all the gaps because everybody who reads it are going to be coming from a different perspective. Somebody is going to know more theory than somebody else. Somebody's going to have more of a feel for it. We're all coming from different things. So you can never write a book and generically and say, hey, everybody's going to get it and everybody's going to start from the same starting point, because that's not true. And then the third one is that the books would be confusing and they would still not have a lot of good explanations. He uses an example of if they said, certain scale worked great over E flat 7, sharp 9, sharp 5, say G Lydian or something, and some augmented scale. You didn't really know why, or the explanation you couldn't understand the explanation, so it was confusing. So anyway, I just thought it would be good to talk a little bit about this. So it's a great book, and unlike most books, if you read the introduction, it'll be like a view of your life or your journey as a guitarist. So hopefully you enjoyed this. And get this. This is good. Ted Greene rocks. All right. Thank you for watching. Bye now.